The auctioneer's voice cut through the dusty air like a rusted blade. Deaf-mute girl, 19 years old. Can't speak, can't hear, can't do much of anything useful. He grabbed Maribel by the wrist and yanked her forward onto the wooden platform. She stumbled but did not fall. Her eyes stayed flat and forward, giving nothing away. Her daddy's selling her off. Says she's been nothing but a burden since the day she was born. Who'll start the bidding? The crowd laughed. Not nervous laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, real laughter. The kind that comes from people who have already decided another human being doesn't count. Mara stood there in a dress that had been washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. Her feet were bare on the splintered wood. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at nothing. Or maybe she looked at everything, in a way none of them could understand. Her father sat on a barrel at the edge of the yard, a bottle balanced on his knee, grinning like a man who just solved a difficult problem. If you were standing in that crowd, watching a 19-year-old girl get sold like livestock in front of her own father, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're not alone. Stories like Mara's remind us that courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just stands there, barefoot, refusing to look away. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's story has traveled. Now let's go back to 1881. Caleb Rourke had not planned to stop. He had ridden into Denton Crossing that morning with one intention: buy a decent horse, maybe two if the price was reasonable, and be back on his land before the sun started its descent. He was not a man who lingered in towns. Towns had too many people and too many opinions and too many conversations that went sideways before they went anywhere useful. He preferred the quiet of open pasture, the low sound of wind through grass, the reliable discomfort of honest work. He was tying his gelding to the post outside the feed store when he heard the auctioneer. He didn't turn around right away. In 1881, auctions were common. Horses, mules, farm equipment, sometimes land. He had no reason to think this one was different. Then he heard the laughter. That specific quality of laughter, mean and easy, the kind that requires no effort because it's aimed at something that can't fight back made. His jaw tightened before he even turned around. He turned around. The girl on the platform was slight, maybe 5'3", with dark hair pulled back unevenly, like she'd done it herself, in a hurry or without a mirror. She was young, too young. And she was standing the way people stand when they've learned that stillness is safer than movement arms at her sides. Chin neither up nor down, eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd. Caleb had seen that posture before. Not on a person, on a horse that had been beaten enough times to stop expecting anything different. Starting bid, $2, the auctioneer called, and somebody in the crowd hooted like it was a joke. Caleb walked closer. He told himself he was just getting a better look. He told himself he wasn't going to get involved. He had enough trouble on his own land without borrowing someone else's. His ranch was 22 miles from town. He had a fence line down on the east boundary and a mare that had gone lame 3 weeks ago and still wasn't right. He did not need a complication. He especially did not need a human complication. He stopped at the edge of the crowd. The auctioneer was talking again, listing the girl's deficiencies like a man selling a broken wagon. Can't hear, can't speak. Father says she's difficult, doesn't follow instructions. Stares at you like she knows something you don't. Probably some-minded, someone near Caleb muttered. And 2 other men nodded, like they'd independently arrived at the same expert conclusion. Caleb looked at the girl's face. She wasn't simple-minded. He didn't know how he knew that from 30 feet away, but he knew it the way you know. A thunderstorm is real before you feel the first drop. There was something behind her eyes that was working, measuring, calculating. She wasn't absent. She was somewhere else, entirely somewhere more private than the rest of them could reach. And that was not the same thing. Her father burped from his barrel and adjusted his bottle. $1. A heavy-set man in a leather apron called from the left side of the crowd. He was grinning at his companion in a way that made Caleb's stomach go cold. $1.50, another voice answered. The girl still hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. But then, and Caleb watched it happen, her eyes shifted, just slightly. They moved across the crowd with a slow, deliberate precision that had nothing random about it, and then they landed on him. She looked directly at Caleb Rourke, not at the crowd, not past him. At him specifically, like she had already sorted through everyone else and reached some kind of conclusion. Caleb felt the back of his neck prickle. He was 34 years old. He had worked cattle since he was 12. He had survived a drought that killed half his herd, a winter that froze the creek solid for 6 weeks, and a fever that had laid him flat for 11 days with no one to check on him. He was not a man who rattled easily. He raised his hand. $5. The crowd went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. $5. You heard me. The heavy-set man in the leather apron turned to look at Caleb. His grin was gone. Who the hell are you? Somebody who just bid $5. Caleb kept his voice level. You want to go higher. Go ahead. Nobody went higher. Silence stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable, and then the auctioneer cleared his throat and called it done with the flat, professional disinterest of a man who didn't care what he was selling as long as the transaction completed. Mara's father slid off his barrel, took the $5 without looking at his daughter, and walked toward the saloon. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He was already recalculating how many drinks $5 could buy before he even cleared the yard. Caleb stood at the base of the platform while Mara climbed down. He had not planned this. He had no idea what came next. He had a lame mare, a downed fence, and now apparently a 19-year-old girl who couldn't hear him speak, and he had absolutely no framework for what to do with any of this. Mara reached the ground and stood in front of him. Up close, she was even younger looking than he'd expected, and something about that made everything worse. She was watching his face with that same careful reading quality she'd turned on him across the crowd like. His expression was a document she was translating. Started to speak, then caught himself. Right. She couldn't hear him. Pointed at himself. Caleb, he said, knowing it was useless, feeling foolish doing it anyway. Mara watched his mouth move. Then she pointed at herself. Mara, she said, and it came out rougher than speech, shaped wrong from a throat that had never heard its own voice, but it was unmistakably her name. Caleb stared at her. She stared back. He turned and walked toward his horse. After a moment, he heard her footsteps behind him, bare feet on dirt, and he didn't know whether that was trust or resignation, or simply the pragmatic decision of someone with no other options. He suspected she didn't know either. The ride back to the ranch took most of the afternoon. Mara sat behind him on the gelding, without complaint, without fidgeting, without any of the small nervous gestures Caleb might have expected from someone in her situation. She was very still. He found himself noticing it, the quality of her stillness, which wasn't the stillness of fear but something else. Attention, maybe. Like she was reading the landscape the way she'd read his face. Halfway home, they passed a stand of cedar along the creek bed, and Mara suddenly pressed her hand lightly against his back, just once, a single flat palm touch, and pointed to the right. Caleb reined in. There, half hidden in the cedar shadows, was a fox caught in a wire snare. It was alive, still struggling weakly, one foreleg twisted in the wire. He looked back at her. She hadn't made a sound. He hadn't said anything. They were moving through open country with wind noise and the gelding's footfalls covering everything. He did not know how she had known. He dismounted, worked the wire loose with his knife, and the fox bolted into the brush. When he climbed back up, Mara was watching the spot where it had disappeared with an expression that was not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Something that looked like relief. Caleb said nothing. He touched the horse forward. He was starting to understand that he had not bought himself a complication. He was starting to understand that he had bought himself a mystery. The ranch didn't look like much. Caleb knew it and had made a kind of peace with knowing it. The house was solid enough. 2 rooms, log construction, a fireplace that drew properly, and a roof that didn't leak except in one corner of the back room, which he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. The barn was larger than the house, which told you everything you needed to know about where his priorities lived. There was a chicken pen, a root cellar, a pump that required coaxing most mornings, and a vegetable patch that was more aspiration than achievement. He showed Mara the back room, a cot, a window, a nail in the wall for hanging things. He didn't apologize for it. He figured she'd seen worse. She ran her hand along the windowsill, feeling the wood grain, and then looked at the view, just picture and sky. And whatever passed across her face in that moment wasn't disappointment. It was something more complicated. He left a candle and a box of matches on the cot and went back to his own room. Night, he lay awake thinking about what he'd done. He'd spent $5 he didn't have to spare on a girl he didn't know, brought her to a ranch that could barely support one person, and had no idea how to communicate with her, care for her, or explain to the occasional ranch hand who might show up what exactly was going on. He also couldn't quite stop thinking about the fox. 3 days passed. Mara did not ask for anything. She woke earlier than Caleb, who was not a late sleeper, and by the time he came out to start the morning fire, she had already pulled water from the pump and set it to heat. He hadn't shown her where anything was. She'd found it herself. She swept without being asked. She mended a rip in the feed sack that had been leaking grain for a week without Caleb noticing. Peeled vegetables with a speed and economy of movement that suggested she'd been cooking for someone else her whole life, which she probably had. And Caleb didn't let himself think about what that household had been like. But it was the horses that told him the most. On the second morning, he came out to find her in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket beside his lame mare, doing nothing, just sitting, not touching the horse, not trying to, just being present. The mare, who had been skittish and difficult since her injury, was standing with one hip cocked in the posture of a relaxed animal, her ears soft, her weight easy. Caleb leaned in the barn doorway and watched. After a while, Mara slowly extended one hand palm up and held it still. The mare dropped her nose to it. Mara didn't move. The mare breathed out a long, slow exhalation through her nostrils, and Mara finally, carefully, rested her fingers against the animal's jaw. Caleb had been trying to get that mare to accept a touch for 3 weeks. He went back to the fence line and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The trouble started in town. He hadn't expected it to stay quiet. Denton Crossing was not a place where things stayed quiet, but he had hoped for more time than he got. On the 5th day, he rode in for supplies, and the feed store owner, a thin man named Driscoll, who had opinions about everything, leaned across the counter and said, "I heard you took the Bell girl. I bought her out of a situation that wasn't right," Caleb said. "She's working at my ranch." Driscoll's mouth made a shape that wasn't quite a smile. "People are talking. People talk about everything. They're saying she's not right. The girl." In the head, Caleb put his money on the counter. "They're wrong." "Caleb." Driscoll lowered his voice, which meant he wanted to gossip rather than inform. "Her own father said she never responded to anything. Said she'd stare at you, like you weren't even there. Said she did things nobody could explain new, when animals were going to do things before they did them, that kind of nonsense. Her father wasn't a good man, but he wasn't entirely. Her father sold her for $5 and walked to the saloon without looking back," Caleb said. "I don't take stock in his assessments." He picked up his supplies and left, but he thought about it on the ride home. The things Driscoll had said new when animals were going to do things. He thought about the fox. He thought about the mare. He thought about how Mara had looked at him across the auction yard, that specific quality of attention. Like she was reading information he didn't know he was transmitting. He didn't know what to call it. He wasn't sure he needed to. The ranch boy showed up a week after Mara arrived. His name was Tad, and he was 14 and came around looking for day work whenever his stepfather had drunk up all the household money, which was frequently. Caleb paid him in meals and small coin to help with fence repair and hauling. He was a wiry, nervous kid who talked constantly to fill silence, which was a habit Caleb had never found a way to cure. When Tad saw Mara, he stopped talking. It lasted about 30 seconds. "Is that the Bell girl?" he said, watching her carry a water bucket across the yard. "From the auction?" "Her name is Mara," Caleb said. "She can't hear anything?" "No, or talk. She makes sounds. They're just not—" Caleb paused, trying to find the word. "Conventional." Tad watched her with an expression that was cautious but not unkind. He was a boy who'd been on the receiving end of enough cruelty to be careful about directing it outward. "She looks like she's listening to something, though," he said, "even when there isn't anything." Caleb looked at him. "Yeah," he said, "she does." That afternoon, Tad made the mistake of getting too close to the mule, who hadn't decided yet what it thought about him. The mule pinned its ears and shifted its weight in a way that meant business, and Caleb was halfway across the yard and too far to intervene when Mara stepped between them. She didn't shout, didn't wave her arms. She just stood there and looked at the mule, the same way she'd looked at the mare, with that complete, unhurried attention. And the mule's ears came forward. Its weight settled. It dropped its head and blew softly through its nose. Tad stared at her. Mara picked up the brush she'd set down and went back to what she was doing. "How'd she do that?" Tad whispered. "I have no idea," Caleb said. "Stop asking questions and fix the fence." But that night, sitting at the table after supper, while Mara worked at something in the corner, she'd found a length of rope and was practicing knots with a quick, precise facility that made Caleb think she'd been watching him work. He found himself thinking that the $5 might have been the least foolish thing he'd ever spent. And then he thought about the town, about Driscoll, about the way people were already talking. He thought about what happened, in his experience, when people in small places started talking about things they didn't understand. Nothing good. That was the answer. Nothing good ever came from it. He looked at Mara, bent over her rope work in the candlelight, and felt something that he couldn't fully name. Not protectiveness exactly, because she didn't seem to need protection. Something more like recognition. Like looking at a landscape you'd never seen before and feeling, without logic or explanation, that you'd been there before. He blew out the candle and went to bed. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves, and the mare stood quiet in her stall. And somewhere past the fence line, a coyote called once and fell silent. And Mara Bell, who had been sold for $5 by a man who should have loved her, slept without sound in the back room of a stranger's house. And for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. The cow started showing signs 2 days before she was supposed to. Caleb knew his animals the way a man knows the floorboards of his own house, by instinct, by repetition, by the particular creaks and silences that mean something is off. This cow, a brindle named for nothing, because Caleb didn't name his cattle, had been bred in March and was due in late November by his calculation. It was the 3rd week of October. He'd checked her that morning, seen nothing alarming, and gone to work on the east fence. Came back at midday and found Mara already in the pasture. She hadn't been sent there. He hadn't said anything to her about the cow. She had simply gone, the way she went to places, before he knew they needed attention, and she was crouched 10 feet from the animal, with both hands resting loose on her knees, watching. Caleb climbed the fence rail and looked at the cow. Then he looked more carefully. The animal was in early labor, no question. The signs were subtle. A slight restlessness in the hindquarters. A way of shifting weight that was different from her usual movement, the beginning of that inward focus that animals got when their bodies were doing something larger than themselves. A man who checked on her twice a day might have caught it by evening. Mara had caught it hours earlier, from across a yard, without being asked to look. "How long has she been at it?" Caleb asked, forgetting himself, and then felt the familiar small foolishness of speaking to someone who couldn't hear him. Mara didn't look up. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the sun and drew a short arc with her fingertip 2 hours. Roughly, since the sun had moved that far. Caleb stared at her. He hadn't taught her that. She'd worked it out herself. He climbed down into the pasture and crouched beside her. Cow shifted, looked at them both with large dark eyes that were already glassy with effort, and then looked away. Together, they waited. The calf came in the late afternoon, slipping into the world sideways, which meant Caleb had to go in with both hands and correct it. Not a clean process, not comfortable for anyone involved, and at one point, the cow threw her head back and nearly connected with Caleb's jaw. He swore. Mara was beside him by then, her hands steady on the cow's flank, and something about her presence seemed to communicate itself to the animal, because the thrashing stopped. Calf hit the ground breathing. Caleb sat back on his heels in the dirt, covered to the elbows in things he didn't care to identify, and looked at the small, wet creature finding its legs on the grass. Then he looked at Mara. She was watching the calf with an expression that was not sentimental. It was something cleaner than that satisfaction, maybe, but the kind that comes from a job done rather than from feeling. Like she'd known this exact moment was coming and was simply confirming the outcome she'd already calculated. "You knew," he said. She didn't hear him, but she looked at him, read something in his face, and gave us a single small nod. He did not know whether she was agreeing with what he'd said or with something she understood on her own terms. He was beginning to think the distinction didn't matter. Tad came back the following week, and this time, he brought trouble without meaning to. He was a good-natured kid, fundamentally, but 14-year-old boys are incapable of keeping things to themselves when those things are interesting. And Mara Bell was the most interesting thing that had happened in Denton Crossing in years. He hadn't told stories about her, exactly. He would have said he was just answering questions, but the result was the same. People knew details now that Caleb hadn't shared. The cow and the calf, the mule in the yard, the way she seemed to know things. Caleb found out when he went to the mill. A man named Burkett, who owned land adjacent to the Rourke property to the north, and had never particularly liked Caleb, stopped him at the mill door, with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was performing concern while actually being something meaner. "I hear that Bell girl predicted the calf," Burkett said. "She noticed signs I missed," Caleb said. "That's not prediction. That's not what Tad says. Tad is 14. Tad says she put her hands on your mule, and it went calm like it had been drugged." Burkett shifted his weight. "Tad says she doesn't sleep like normal people. Says she walks the property at night." Caleb had not known that last part. He kept his face neutral. "At night?" "So Tad says." Burkett looked at him steadily. "I'm not trying to make trouble, Rourke. I'm just telling you what people are saying. Deaf-mute girl who predicts livestock births and walks around in the dark and makes animals go calm when she touches them. That's going to make people nervous. This is a frontier town. People here don't have a lot of patience for things they can't explain. Then maybe they should try harder," Caleb said, and went inside. Thought about it on the ride home. He thought about it harder than he wanted to. That night, he sat in his chair after supper and watched Mara without making it obvious he was watching. She was doing what she often did in the evenings. Something quiet with her hands, tonight braiding 3 lengths of leather cord with a speed and evenness that suggested muscle memory. But every few minutes she would stop, tilt her head slightly, and be still for a moment before resuming, as if she were listening to something, which she couldn't be, couldn't hear, but she was responding to something. Some input that Caleb couldn't identify. After a while, he got up and went to the window. The yard was empty. The barn was dark. The sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of Texas sky that made you feel the size of things you'd rather not think about. He went to bed. And then, at some point in the deep middle of the night, he half woke to hear the soft sound of the back door, the one off the kitchen, opening and then closing again. He lay there in the dark. It was Mara, he knew. He didn't get up. He lay there thinking about what she could be doing out there in the dark, walking land she'd only lived on for 2 weeks. in a territory that was not kind to solitary women at night. He thought about going after her. He decided not to. He didn't know why he decided not to. It went against every practical instinct he had, but something told him she was safer out there than most people would be, for reasons he couldn't articulate. He was right. She came back an hour later. He heard the door, heard her footsteps cross the kitchen floor, heard the soft creak of the cot in the back room. In the morning, he found a dead rattlesnake outside the back door. She'd laid it out straight, which meant she'd killed it herself, and she'd left it there, not hidden, not thrown away, where he would see it, where he would know. He stood there looking at it for a while. Then he picked it up by the tail and carried it to the brush pile, and said nothing about it, and neither did she. The rain started on a Wednesday. Nothing unusual about rain in October, and the first 2 days of it were welcome. The creek had been low all summer, and the pasture grass was grateful for it. Caleb worked inside, mended tack, did the kind of maintenance that the outdoor work always pushed aside, and Mara worked alongside him with a quiet efficiency that he had stopped finding remarkable, only because remarkable things, if they happen consistently enough, begin to feel ordinary. On the third morning, the rain changed. It wasn't louder exactly, but it had a different quality, a weight to it, a pressure, like the sky had made a decision. The wind shifted twice in an hour, which was the kind of behavior that meant weather was building rather than passing. Caleb went to the door and looked out and didn't like what he saw to the southwest, which was a particular shade of gray that he associated with bad outcomes. He turned around, and Mara was standing in the middle of the room. She was already dressed for outside her work coat, on her boots laced. She hadn't been dressed for outside when he'd gone to the door 30 seconds ago. She was watching him with an expression of focused urgency that he hadn't seen on her face before, and she was holding her hands in a configuration he didn't recognize, pointing at the barn, then at him, then making a motion with both arms that he interpreted as come. "Now move the horses," he said. She shook her head, pointed at the barn again, then at the east wall of the barn specifically, then made a different gesture, both palms pushing outward, away, like something expanding under pressure. Caleb looked at the barn. He looked at the sky. The east wall of the barn was the oldest section. He'd known for 2 seasons that it needed reinforcing. He hadn't gotten to it. "You think the barn's going to—" Mara grabbed his arm. "Moke." She wasn't strong enough to pull him anywhere he didn't want to go, but the grip was certain, not frantic, and she was already moving toward the door with the expectation that he would follow. That's what made him move. Not fear in her face. There wasn't fear exactly, but the specific certainty of someone who is not guessing. He followed her out into the rain. The wind hit them sideways. It was harder than it had been 10 minutes ago, which was itself harder than it had been 20 minutes before that. Mara went straight to the barn, threw the doors open, and went for the horses without hesitation. Caleb went for the lame mare because she would be the slowest. They moved 4 horses out in 10 minutes, tying them to the heavy posts on the lee side of the house. The rain was coming at an angle by then, and the wind was doing something Caleb didn't like: cycling. Building pressure in cycles rather than blowing constant. And he had just closed the door to the house and turned toward Mara when it hit. Not the full storm, a gust, a massive single exhalation of pressure from the southwest, and the sound it made as it crossed the yard was like a freight train deciding to be somewhere else in a hurry. It hit the barn, and the east wall went, not all at once, but in a sequence. First, the corner post cracking like a gunshot, and then the wall itself leaning inward, and then the roof coming down on the east side in a cascading collapse that sent a wave of dust and wood fragments out through the doors. Caleb stood in the rain and looked at it. If the horses had still been in there, 2 of them would be dead, maybe 3. He turned to look at Mara. She was already watching him, had been watching him. He suspected minds since the moment the wall went, waiting to see his face. She didn't look satisfied or vindicated. She looked tired, the way you look when you've done something physically difficult and it's over. like the anticipation of the thing had cost her more than the thing itself. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure any words he had were adequate to what had just happened. He went and stood beside her, and they both looked at the collapsed east wall of his barn while the rain came down, and the horses, tied to the house posts, shifted their feet and pinned their ears and waited for the world to make sense again. After a while, Mara reached into the pocket of her work coat and took out a small piece of chalk. She kept it there. He knew by now, and the way some men kept a folding knife, and she held it out to him. He took it, not understanding. She pointed at the ground. He looked at her, confused, and she made a patient gesture, write something, then gestured at herself. She wanted him to write to her. They'd communicated with chalk before, him writing words she'd learned to read, from God knows where, but she'd never been the one to initiate it. He crouched down and, feeling somewhat absurd, wrote in the mud, with the chalk end, "How did you know?" She took the chalk back from him, thought for a moment, then wrote 2 words in a large, deliberate print, "The air." He looked at those 2 words for a long time. The air, not the sky, not the clouds, not the wind. The air itself. Whatever Maribel was reading, it wasn't the same text everyone else had access to. Took the chalk and wrote, "How long have you been able to do this?" She took it back. Wrote, "Always." Then she looked at him, checking his face for the reaction she'd probably learned to dread. The fear, the suspicion, the backing away from something that didn't fit inside a known category. Kept his face steady. He wasn't entirely sure what he was feeling, but it wasn't fear. It was something more like the sensation of standing at the edge of a very large body of water and realizing it goes much deeper than you'd thought. She seemed to find whatever she was looking for in his expression, because she put the chalk away and turned back to the horses. The boy's name was Petey Greer, and he was 8 years old, and he came to the ranch with his mother on a Thursday afternoon, looking the way children look when they are badly frightened, and trying to hide it, chin up, eyes too careful, mouth held in a line that didn't quite work. His mother sucked. A thin woman named Agnes, with hands that were cracked from work, and a face that had been pretty 20 years ago, took off her hat when she came into the yard and addressed Caleb directly, ignoring Mara completely, which was what most people did. "I heard she helps with animals," Agnes said. "She has some knowledge with animals." "Yes." Agnes hesitated. "My boy's got a fever. Been 3 days. The doctor in town gave me something, but it's not doing what it should." Caleb said nothing. "I heard." She stopped. Started again. "People say she's strange." "I know what people say, but my boy is sick, and the doctor wants me to come back and pay him another $2, and I don't have $2. And her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and went silent. Caleb looked at Mara. Mara had been watching Agnes and the boy the entire time. She was standing by the pump, still, with that reading quality in her eyes that he'd stopped trying to understand and simply trusted. When Caleb looked at her, she was already looking at him, and she gave a small nod. He stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. What followed was not magical. Caleb wanted to be clear about that in his own mind. Later, when he tried to make sense of it, Mara did not perform anything. She did not wave her hands over the boy, or speak in tongues, or produce any kind of theatrical effect. She sat beside Petey Greer on the cot in the back room, and she looked at him with the same unhurried attention she gave everything. And she touched his forehead, just the back of her hand, the simple temperature check that every mother and every practical person knew. And then she looked at his throat, pulling gently at his collar and tipping his chin up to look. Then his hands, she turned them over and looked at the palms and the wrists. She got up and went into the kitchen. She was in there for 20 minutes. Caleb stayed in the doorway, not interfering. He heard her moving around, heard the sound of dried things being broken or ground, heard water being heated. Agnes sat on the edge of the cot, holding her boy's hand and didn't speak, which suggested she was praying, though Caleb kept that observation to himself. What Mara brought back was a tin cup of something dark, and not particularly pleasant smelling. She handed it to Agnes, who looked at it, looked at Caleb, looked at Mara. Mara pointed at the boy, then at the cup, then made a tipping gesture, drink it, then held up 2 fingers and pointed at the window, twice a day, 2 days. Agnes said, "What is it?" Mara couldn't answer. Caleb said, "I don't know, but I've watched her work. I'd give it to him." Agnes looked at her boy, who's watching Mara with the specific trust that sick children sometimes extend to people who seem to know what they're doing. And then she looked at Mara again, and something in her face shifted. She gave the boy the cup. He made a face. He drank it. They left an hour later, Agnes with the remaining mixture in a jar, and instructions Caleb had written out for her because Mara couldn't write words. Agnes could read yet, and Caleb stood in the yard watching them go and thinking about the look on the boy's face when Mara had come back into the room. That specific look of a child who has decided, on some animal instinct level, that the person approaching them is not a threat. Children and animals. They saw something in Mara that the adults in Denton Crossing were too busy being afraid to notice. Petey Greer's fever broke in 2 days. Agnes came back the following week to say so, and she brought eggs, a dozen of them, wrapped in cloth, and she handed them to Mara directly this time, not to Caleb. She looked at Mara when she said thank you, which was also something she hadn't done the first time. Maris accepted the eggs without expression. But after Agnes left, Caleb caught her standing at the kitchen window, watching the woman's cart disappear down the road, and on her face was something he could only describe as careful hope. The expression of someone who has been burned enough times to be suspicious of warmth, but who is, despite all evidence and experience, still capable of wanting it. He went outside and let her have the moment alone. The gratitude didn't last. It never did in Caleb's experience, when the thing you were grateful for made you uncomfortable. Agnes Greer had told 3 people about Petey's fever and Mara's remedy, because Agnes was a woman who believed in giving credit. 2 of those 3 people told it properly: a sick child, a practical treatment, a good outcome. The 3rd person told it the way some people can't help but tell things, which is with a particular spin applied, a particular emphasis on the strange parts, the parts that don't fit. By the following week, the story circulating in Denton Crossing was not about a woman who knew herbs and observation. It was about a deaf-mute girl who had done something to a sick boy that nobody could explain, using things she kept in a stranger's kitchen, and whose presence on Caleb Rourke's ranch had preceded a barn collapsing, birth 2 weeks early, and a rattlesnake appearing dead outside a door. The story also included, and this was the part that Caleb heard last and liked least, the information that she walked the property alone at night. Found out about the new shape of the story from Tad, who came in one afternoon looking uncomfortable, in the way of someone who has bad news and is trying to decide how to deliver it. "There's talk," Tad said. "I know there's talk." "No." Tad scraped at the ground with his boot heel. "Not just regular talk. There was a meeting. At Burkett's place. I wasn't there, but my stepfather was, and he told my mother, and my mother told me to tell you because she said you ought to know." Caleb set down the harness he was working on. "What kind of meeting?" Tad wouldn't meet his eyes. "About Mara. About whether she should be here." Temperature in Caleb's chest dropped about 10 degrees. "They think she brought the sickness to the Greer boy," Tad continued, talking faster now, getting it out. They said if she could make animals go calm, she could make them go wrong too. They said the early calf was unnatural. They said the barn wall coming down on the same day as that big storm was. They said it was too much coincidence. Her showing up and then all these things happening. She saved the horses, Caleb said. She got them out before the wall came down. "I know that. The calf lived. The cow lived. I know that too. Cured that boy's fever with Caleb." Tad finally looked up. "I know. I was there for the mule. I was there when she knew about the cow. I know what I saw. But I'm 14, and my stepfather's fist is bigger than my head, so..." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless honesty. "I'm just telling you what's coming." Caleb looked across the yard to where Mara was stringing new wire along the repaired section of the east fence. She'd volunteered for it, or as close to volunteering as she came, which was showing up with the wire already in her hands. She worked with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. She didn't know this conversation was happening. She had no way of knowing. He thought about her face at the auction, the way she'd been standing on that platform with the crowd laughing, and her father on his barrel with a bottle on his knee, and the way she'd looked across all of it and found him in the crowd and just looked. No plea in it, no performance. Just a direct, unafraid look from a girl who had been told by everyone who should have protected her that she was worth nothing. "Go home, Tad," Caleb said. Tad went. Caleb stayed where he was and watched Mara work and thought about the specific mathematics of this situation. One man, one woman who couldn't hear or speak, 20 miles from the nearest real authority, and a town that had decided it was afraid. He thought about what afraid people did in frontier territories in 1881. He thought about it carefully, without flinching. Then he went inside and ate his supper. Mara came in as it was getting dark, washed her hands at the basin, and sat across from him at the table. He'd left food out for her, which had been their arrangement since the first week, without ever discussing it. She ate with her usual efficiency. Caleb ate without tasting much. At some point she looked up and found him watching her. She didn't look away. She tilted her head slightly and made a small gesture, both palms up, a questioning shape. He shook his head. Nothing, or nothing yet. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was reading more from his face than he'd intended to put there. That she knew he wasn't telling her something. That she'd probably been tracking the change in the town's attitude for longer than he had, because she had sensed it, in the way she sensed everything, by some method that operated below the frequency that most people could detect. She looked back down at her food. She wasn't surprised. That was the thing he couldn't stop thinking about as he lay awake later, staring at the ceiling while the wind worked at the eaves. Whatever was coming from that town, whatever form it took, however ugly it got, Mara Bell was not going to be surprised by it. She had been waiting for it since before she arrived. Probably since long before that. Probably since the first time she'd understood something about an animal or a storm or a fever that no one else could see, and watched the faces of the people around her shift from wonder into something colder and more dangerous. The question was not whether she was ready for it. The question was whether he was. They came on a Tuesday. Caleb had been half expecting it for 10 days ever since Tad's warning, ever since the night he'd lain awake, doing the math on what frightened people do in frontier territories. But knowing something is coming and having it actually arrive are different experiences. And when he heard the horses in the yard at dusk, the sound of them hit him differently than he'd imagined. He counted from the window. 8 horses, 8 riders. They carried lanterns because the sun was already gone behind the ridge, and the lantern light made everything look worse than it probably was, threw long shadows across the yard, made ordinary faces into something harder and stranger. But Caleb looked at those faces and recognized most of them, and recognizing them didn't make him feel better. These were not drifters, not strangers. These were men he had bought feed from, nodded to at the mill, passed on the road for years without incident. Burkett was at the front, which Caleb had expected. Beside him was the heavy-set man from the auction, the one in the leather apron who'd started the bidding, whose name turned out to be Crail, and who ran a harness shop on the main road and had, until this moment, given Caleb no reason to think about him much one way or the other. There were 2 men in the back whose names Caleb didn't know. That bothered him more than the ones he recognized. Known men have known limits. Strangers brought to someone else's confrontation have agreed to something in advance, and you don't always know what. Mara was in the barn. That was his first thought. Not strategy, not self-preservation, but the immediate specific knowledge that she was in the barn and would not hear them arrive, and the barn was on the far side of the yard. and if things went badly, that distance could become a problem very fast. He took his rifle from the hook by the door. He didn't load it, because loading it would make this something it hadn't become yet. Took it. He went outside. Burkett pulled his horse up short when Caleb appeared on the porch, and the group behind him shuffled and settled in the way that groups do when their momentum is interrupted. They'd been expecting to have to knock. They'd prepared themselves for a door. A man already standing on his own porch, with a rifle in his hand, was a different opening than they'd rehearsed. "Rourke," Burkett said. "Burkett." Caleb came down the 2 porch steps and stopped. Close enough to talk, far enough to have options. Little late for a social call. "We're not here socially." "I can see that." Burkett glanced at the rifle. "You planning to use that?" "Not if I don't have to." Caleb rested it in the crook of his elbow, barrel down, which was the position that said, "I have it, but I'm not raising it yet." "What do you want?" Burkett looked at the men around him checking, gathering something from their presence, and then looked back at Caleb. "The girl," he said. "We want her gone." The yard was quiet enough that Caleb could hear the horses breathing. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "Rourke." It was Crail who spoke from the side, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who's decided he's the reasonable one in the group. "Nobody's here to do anybody harm. We're concerned citizens. We have a legitimate concern." "What concern?" "That woman is not natural," Crail said flatly. "I watched her at the auction. The way she looked at people. The way she stood there on that platform, like none of it was touching her. Animals don't act that way, let alone people. Since you brought her here, your barn fell down. There's been sickness in the Greer household. P.T. Greer had a fever before Mara came anywhere near that family," Caleb said. "She's the one who broke it." "That's not what I heard." "Then you heard wrong." Crail's jaw tightened. "I heard she brewed something up in your kitchen and made the boy drink it. Nobody knows what was in it. Nobody asked. A sick boy drank something a deaf-mute mixed together in the dark, and now people are saying she cured him. But what if she'd done the opposite? What if she didn't? But she could have. The word could have landed in the yard and sat there, and Caleb understood then what he was actually dealing with. Not facts, not evidence. The men standing in his yard with their lanterns and their certainty had not come because of anything Mara had actually done. They had come because of what she might do, what she could do, what was possible in their imaginations. An imagination, he had learned a long time ago, is not an argument you can win with facts. "I want to speak to her," Burkett said. "She can't hear you." "Then I want to look at her. I want to see her face." "You're not going anywhere near her." Burkett's horse shifted and Burkett led it, using the movement to edge a foot forward. "You don't have a say in this, Rourke. She's not your property. You bought her freedom. Fair enough, but that means she's a free person. And a free person can be asked to leave a community that doesn't want her." "She's on my land," Caleb said. "My land is not your community. Your land is 20 miles from this town, and between here and there is 20 miles of open territory that belongs to everyone, and she walks it at night." Burkett let that sit for a second. Alone. At night. "What is she doing out there, Rourke? What is she looking for?" "Snakes," Caleb said. A beat of silence. "She kills the rattlesnakes before they get into the yard," Caleb said. "That's what she's doing at night. You want to call that unnatural? Go ahead. Call it useful." One of the men in the back, one of the ones he didn't know, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. Caleb didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Burkett. "This isn't going to end here," Burkett said. His voice had dropped. More private now, less performative. "I'm telling you that as I'm not your enemy, Rourke, but there are people in this group who are less reasonable than I am, and they're going to keep pushing this. And eventually it's going to come to a point where me standing in your yard talking about it is the best outcome you're going to get. You understand what I'm saying? I understand you're threatening me with the people standing behind you. I'm telling you what's coming. Then I'll tell you what's already here." Caleb looked at the group, all of them, slowly, face to face, and he was aware that his heartbeat had slowed in a way he didn't entirely trust, the way it always slowed when something became unavoidable. I've watched Mara Bell work every day for 3 weeks. I've watched her save a calf that would have died without her. I've watched her pull horses out of a barn that would have killed them. I watched her break a boy's fever when your doctor in town couldn't manage it. And I watched her sit with my lame mare for 2 hours until that animal trusted her enough to be touched, and that mare hadn't trusted anything since the injury. Paused. So I'm going to tell you what she is. She's the hardest working person on this ranch. She's more observant than anyone I've met, man or woman. She's never asked me for anything she hasn't earned. And she has never, not once, done a single thing that hurt any living creature on this property or off it. He looked at Burkett directly. You want her gone. You'll have to come back with something better than fear. And you'll have to go through me to get to her. The yard held the silence. Then from behind him came the sound of the barn door. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the group. He heard Mara's footsteps cross the yard. She'd felt the vibration of the horses, probably, or seen the lantern light under the barn door, and then she was standing beside him. Not behind him, beside him. She'd come out of the barn carrying a brush, which meant she'd been grooming the horses and had come directly without putting anything down. She stood with the brush in one hand at her side and looked at the 8 men on horseback, with an expression that Caleb could only describe as diagnostic. The same look she gave an injured animal, reading it, cataloging what it was showing her. Nobody spoke for a moment. And then Mara, Nusis, who could not hear the conversation that had just happened, who had no way of knowing what had been said or what had been threatened, did something that Caleb would think about for the rest of his life. She looked at Burkett, held his gaze for 3 full seconds, steady and unafraid. Then she looked at Crail, then at each of the other men in turn, the same 3 count, the same directness. She was not challenging them. She wasn't performing bravery. She was simply looking at them the way she looked at everything, honestly, completely, without the protective filtering that most people used when they looked at things that frightened them. One of the men in the back looked away first, then another. Burkett held the longest, but even he shifted his gaze eventually, moving to some middle distance that was safer than her eyes. Mara looked at Caleb. She tilted her head slightly, that familiar questioning gesture. He shook his head. Nothing for you to worry about. She studied his face for a moment, clearly not entirely convinced, and then she turned and walked back to the barn. The sound of the door closing was very final. Burkett gathered his reins. He looked at Caleb with an expression that had something complicated in it. Not quite defeat, not quite respect. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. This isn't over, he said. It is for tonight, Caleb said. They rode out. Caleb stood in the yard until the lantern light disappeared down the road, and then he stood there a while longer. The night was very quiet. The horses Mara had been grooming moved softly in the barn. Somewhere out past the fence line, a nighthawk called. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. That surprised him, because he felt like they shouldn't be. He went inside, put the rifle back on its hook, and sat at the table. He sat there for a long time, without lighting a lamp. In the dark, he thought about what he'd said in the yard, the exact words, the order he'd said them, whether he'd meant them, or whether they'd come out of some defensive instinct that didn't necessarily represent a position he'd thought through. He'd meant them. That was the thing. He'd meant every word. He thought about that. In the morning, Mara found him at the table before dawn. She'd apparently felt him get up, because she came out of the back room already dressed, which meant she'd either slept in her clothes or not slept much. She looked at him. He looked at her. He pushed a cup of cold coffee across the table because he hadn't gotten around to heating it, and she sat down and wrapped both hands around it without drinking. He took out the chalk. He wrote, 8 men came last night. They want you to leave. She read it. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something around her eyes went very still, the way things go still right before they settle into permanence. He wrote, I told them no. She looked at that for a moment. Then she looked at him. He wrote, you don't have to stay if you don't want to. That's different. She took the chalk from him and wrote in her large, careful print, "Where would I go?" It was not a question, he understood. It was not asking for suggestions. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the only form available to her. Where would she go? Where had she ever gone? She had been sold by her father, purchased by a stranger, and had made herself useful in a place that was not hers. And the town that ought to have been a community for her was instead a group of men on horseback with lanterns at dusk. He took the chalk and wrote, "You could go to a city. There are people who work with." He stopped. He didn't know how to finish that sentence. People who work with what? People like her. He didn't know what like her even meant. He started over. He wrote, "You could go somewhere bigger where people wouldn't notice." She read that. Then she wrote with a flatness that was its own kind of answer, "People always notice." He sat with that for a while. Then he wrote, "I know." She pushed the chalk back to him and picked up the cold coffee and finally drank some of it, and neither of them wrote anything else for a long while. Outside, the sky was getting lighter in the east in that slow but reluctant way it had in October, like the day wasn't entirely sure it wanted to happen. Caleb thought about what he'd told those men, about what she'd earned, about what she'd done and hadn't done. He thought about the look on Burkett's face when Mara had walked out of the barn, the way the man's certainty had flinched, just slightly at the reality of her. It was one thing to be afraid of a concept. It was another thing to have the concept look at you with calm, interested eyes and make you feel, without a word, like the problem under examination. He also thought about what Burkett had said. This isn't over. He believed him. He rode to town 3 days later because he needed wire for the fence and because he had decided, after considerable internal argument, that the worst thing he could do was disappear from Denton Crossing. Absence created rumors. Presence at least had the advantage of giving people something accurate to react to. He went to the feed store first. Driscoll was behind the counter, and the look he gave Caleb when he walked in was the look of a man who had heard things and was deciding in real time how to arrange his face around them. "Here you had some visitors," Driscoll said. "I heard that too," Caleb said. "Wire. 100 feet. Driscoll got the wire. He set it on the counter and fussed with the wrapping and didn't say anything for a moment, which meant he was building to something. "You know Burkett's not entirely wrong," he said finally, "about the community having a stake in who lives on the surrounding land. She lives on my land, not community land. The water you use is community water. The road you ride is community road." Driscoll's voice had the tone of a man who has thought about this and considers himself reasonable. "I'm not saying she's what they're saying she is. I'm just saying people need to understand things. Out here, you can't have something living in your midst that nobody understands." "Plenty of things live in our midst that nobody understands," Caleb said. "We don't run all of them off. She's not a—" Driscoll stopped. "She's not a what?" Driscoll pressed his mouth shut and counted out the change. Caleb took it and the wire and went to the door, and then he stopped, turned around. "You know what I've noticed," Caleb said, "in 20 years of ranching? The things people understand least are usually the things most worth trying to understand, and the things people are fastest to call unnatural are usually just natural things they haven't bothered to learn." He looked at Driscoll steadily. "She's a 19-year-old girl who grew up without anyone to teach her anything, except how to survive people like the ones who raised her. Everything she knows, she learned herself. And what she knows is more useful than anything being taught in this town." He went out. He did the rest of his errands efficiently and without incident, and he was almost to his horse when Agnes Greer appeared from the alley between the dry goods store and the saddle shop, moving fast, like she'd been watching for him. "Mr. Rourke," she said quietly, "I heard about the men who went to your place. News travels. I want you to know." She stopped, looked both ways along the street in a way that was both nervous and resolved. "Petey is completely well. He hasn't had so much as a sniffle since. Whatever she gave him, whatever she did." Agnes shook her head. "I'm not a woman who goes against what my neighbors think, Mr. Rourke. I've got a son to raise and no husband, and I need these people's goodwill. But I also know what she did for my boy. I appreciate you saying so. If it comes to something more, if they do something more official than a nighttime visit. Agnes met his eyes. I'll say what I know. I'll stand up and say it. I want you to tell her that. He thought about how to explain that telling Mara wasn't quite as simple as that, and then he decided it wasn't the relevant part of what Agnes had just offered. Thank you, he said. It'll mean something. Agnes nodded once, sharply, and went back the way she'd come. Caleb rode home. He was 3 miles out of town when he let himself feel, just briefly, the thing he'd been managing since the moment those 8 horses appeared in his yard. The specific cold knowledge of how badly this could go. The math of one man and one woman against a community that had decided it was afraid, pushed it down. Fear didn't fix fences, and it didn't answer questions. He had a ranch to run. 2 weeks after the night visit, Crail came alone. That was unexpected. Caleb was splitting wood in the side yard when the harness maker rode up, and there was something in the way he approached Trope. No lantern, midday, alone. That was different enough from the first time to make Caleb lower the axe and wait. Crail stopped his horse at the yard's edge and didn't dismount. He sat there for a moment, looking at the wood pile, and then at Caleb, and then at some neutral point that was neither. My wife has a horse, he said. Mare, 8 years old. She's been. There's something wrong with the way she moves. Not lame exactly. Something in the shoulder, the way she favors it. I've had the doctor look. The animal doctor. Not he stopped. Started over. I've had somebody look and they can't find what it is. Mare's miserable. My wife is attached to that animal. Caleb said nothing. I heard about the lame mare here, Crail said. I heard it was bad, and then it wasn't. The silence extended. Crail finally looked at him directly. I know how this looks, he said. I know you do. I was there that night, I remember. Crail worked his jaw. I've got a wife who loves that horse. I had reasons for what I thought. I still think there's something not ordinary about that girl. But I also think... He stopped again. This was clearly a man who did not find his own thoughts easy to organize. I think maybe not ordinary isn't the same as dangerous, and I think my wife's horse is suffering. Caleb set the axe against the woodpile. Get down, he said. I'll ask her. He asked Mara in chalk, which had become the standard method. A man's horse is hurting. Will you look at it? She read the words and looked at Crail, who was standing in the yard holding his horse's reins, and very obviously trying not to seem like someone who had recently been part of a group demanding she be expelled from the county. Whatever she read in his face, and Caleb suspected she read more than Crail would have been comfortable knowing, she gave her single small nod. They rode to Crail's place the following morning. The mare was exactly as described. Not dramatically lame, but moving wrong, guarding her left shoulder with a compensatory stiffness that had migrated into her neck and was starting to affect her gait overall. Crail's wife, a solid woman named Ruth, who had clearly made the decision to reserve judgment and simply watch, stood by the fence and didn't speak. Mara spent 40 minutes with the horse. She moved around it in a slow circle first, watching. Then she stood at its shoulder for a long time, with both hands very still on the animal's side, and her eyes went to that particular focused distance that Caleb recognized by now as her version of deep listening. She pressed at specific points along the shoulder and neck, watching the horse's ears and the tension in its muscles for feedback that she apparently received in forms too subtle for Caleb to track. She had the horse walked back and forth twice, watching the movement from different angles. Then she turned to Caleb and made a gesture right hand, describing a circular motion at the base of her own neck. He wrote on his chalkboard, "In the neck, not the shoulder?" She nodded. Wrote back, "Shoulder is the pain. Neck is the cause." He showed it to Crail. Crail looked at it for a while. The animal doctor looked at the shoulder. He said, "I know," Caleb said. Mara spent another 20 minutes doing something with her hands at the horse's neck. Not rough, not surgical. More like a sustained pressure applied at points that clearly meant something to her. The horse resisted at first, then went very still, then released a long, shuddering breath and dropped its head. Ruth made a sound from the fence. When Mara stepped back, the horse shook its head and then slowly, testing moved its left shoulder in a way it hadn't been moving it when they arrived. Ruth said, "What did she do?" "I don't know exactly," Caleb said. "But look at your horse." Ruth looked at her horse. Nobody said anything for a moment. Mara went to wash her hands at the pump. She was methodical about it. Both hands, thorough, the way she was thorough about everything. She didn't look at Crail or Ruth or at Caleb. She just washed her hands. Crail watched her. He had an expression on his face that was doing a difficult thing, trying to reconcile what he'd come prepared to believe with what he'd just watched with his own eyes. It was not a comfortable expression. Being wrong is never comfortable, and being wrong in a way that also means you were frightened. For no good reason is the specific kind of wrong that stings the most. "What do I owe her?" Crail asked. "Nothing," Caleb said. "She doesn't take payment. She should. Talk to her about it, then." Crail looked at Mara. He cleared his throat. She was facing the other direction. He looked at Caleb helplessly. "She can't hear you," Caleb said, "but she can read a face. Go look at her, and she'll know." Crail walked to where Mara stood drying her hands. She turned when she felt his approach and looked at him. He stood there awkwardly for a second, and then he did something that surprised Caleb. He took his hat off. Just that. Took his hat off and held it at his side, which in 9881 was about as close to an apology as a man like Crail was likely to get without actually using the word. Mara looked at him. She tilted her head slightly and made a gesture with her hand small, dismissive, like setting something down. Over. It was done. Crail nodded and put his hat back on. Riding home, Caleb thought about that exchange den and what it had cost each of them. The man who had to eat some things he didn't want to eat, and the woman who had to decide, again, whether to trust someone who had already failed her once. He thought about how Mara had made that gesture, not gracious, not magnanimous, not the performed forgiveness of someone who wants credit for it. Just over. Done. Move forward. He wondered if she'd always been like that, or if it was something she'd built out of necessity, the same way she'd built everything else she had. November came in cold, and it came in fast. The first hard frost hit on a Thursday, which meant winter was not going to behave itself, and Caleb spent most of that week winterizing the remaining sections of barn. The east wall had been rebuilt with proper support. Caleb and Tad working 3 days solid to do it, and making sure the water supply wouldn't freeze before he'd had time to plan for it. Mara worked alongside him on all of it. She had developed an understanding of the ranch's systems that was, by Caleb's estimate, roughly equal to his own on most matters and superior on several. She knew which sections of fence were stressed before he did. She knew which water lines would freeze first. She had, without being asked, begun laying in a particular store of roots and dried herbs in the root cellar, and Caleb had learned enough not to question her preparations. There were evenings now that were different from the early ones. Not comfortable, exactly, because he was not a comfortable man and she was not a comfortable woman, but something more than two people sharing a space out of circumstance. They had developed a vocabulary, not just the chalk words, though those had multiplied, and Mara had become quick with them in a way that suggested she'd been learning written language faster than he'd realized. But a vocabulary of gesture, of expression, of timing. He knew what her particular stillness meant, and she knew what his jaw set meant, and they had managed to fight once. A real disagreement about whether to sell 2 of the younger horses before winter, and survived it, which is perhaps the truest test of whether a vocabulary is working. The fight had been brief and unsatisfying in the way of fights where both parties are too pragmatic to sustain a performance. He'd written his reasons. She'd written hers. He'd been wrong about 2 of his reasons and right about 1. She'd been right about 2 of hers and wrong about 1. They'd sold 1 horse and kept the other, which turned out to be the correct decision, and neither of them brought it up again. It was Tad who told them about the boy. He came riding in on a gray afternoon, his horse moving faster than Tad usually pushed it, and before he'd even dismounted, he was already talking. "There's a boy missing," he said. "Tommy Hatch, 7 years old. He wandered off this morning from the Hatch place, That's 6 miles south. They've had men looking since noon. Caleb thought about the Hatch property. Dense cedar breaks along the creek, rough ground to the south, where the land rolled up toward the limestone shelf. Not kind country for a grown man moving fast. Less kind for a small boy moving without any direction at all. How many men searching? He asked. 8, maybe 10 by now. But it's going to be dark in 2 hours. Tad stopped. He was looking at Mara, who had come out of the barn when she felt the horse's rapid approach. His expression was the expression of a boy who has learned to think of something obvious too late to pretend he didn't think of it. Don't say it like you're asking permission, Caleb said. Could she help? Caleb looked at Mara. She was watching Tad's face, reading his agitation, her own expression alert and focused. He took out the chalk and wrote on the flat top of the fence post, "Boy missing in the cedar. 7 years old. Lost since morning." Mara read it. She looked at the south horizon for 3 seconds, something moving in her expression that he'd learned to identify as calculation. The process of reading information he couldn't see. Then she turned and went back into the barn. She came out with 2 horses tacked and ready in the time it took Caleb to get his coat. They found the searchers spread across a half-mile of ground south of the Hatch property, moving with the disorganized overlap of men who have agreed to look but not agreed on where or how. Caleb recognized the group immediately. Some of them recognized Mara too, and a few faces tightened in the way he had expected. Jacob Hatch was there, the boy's father, a tall, raw-boned man with the look of someone for whom fear had already burned through into something more desperate. He looked at Mara when Caleb introduced her, couldn't help himself, with an expression that moved through recognition, discomfort, and calculation all in about 2 seconds. "She knows tracking?" Hatch asked Caleb. "She knows things," Caleb said, which was the most accurate thing he could have said. Hatch looked at his boy's name, Tommy, he said, his voice going rough on it. "Tommy's been out since 9 this morning, and Caleb wrote it for Mara in the chalk so she understood who they were looking for." She read it. She nodded once, and then she knelt on the ground. Right there in the middle of the group of men, she knelt on the ground and put her palms flat against the dirt. Not dramatically, not theatrically. She did it the way she did everything, with that practical, workmanlike focus that left no room for performance. She was reading the ground. Caleb didn't know how else to describe it. She was reading something in the earth that the men standing around her couldn't read, and their eyes went to each other above her head in the way that people's eyes go when they don't know what to make of something. She stood. She pointed south-southwest toward the limestone shelf, away from where most of the men were searching. Hatch looked at the direction she was pointing and then at Caleb. "The creek runs that way," he said, "but my boy knows to stay away from the creek. I've told him since he could walk." Caleb looked at Mara. She had turned to look at him at the same moment, and when their eyes met, she tapped her own chest, her own judgment, her own reading, and held his gaze. He looked at Hatch. "Your boy knows where he's supposed to stay," he said. "But a frightened boy doesn't always remember what he knows." Hatch's jaw worked. He looked at the direction she'd pointed, and then back at the men, searching in the wrong direction, and then at the sky, which was going gold and copper with the last of the afternoon light. "All right," he said. It came out rough, like something he'd had to break off from somewhere inside him. "All right." They went south-southwest. Mara moved fast, which Caleb hadn't expected. He'd thought she'd be slower, more methodical, but she covered ground with a focused energy that kept him and Hatch in a near trot to keep pace. She wasn't tracking in any conventional sense that Caleb could identify. She wasn't bent over studying footprints, wasn't breaking to examine broken branches. She moved like she was following a direction that she'd already been given, checking certain things as she went. The ground at particular points, the way the cedar branches held their shape, disturbed earth around a rock outcropping. She paused at for 15 seconds before moving on, breathing hard beside him. "What is she doing?" he said, low enough that it wasn't a challenge, It was a genuine question from a man who had run out of other options and was watching something he didn't understand with the desperate hope that it would work. "Stopped asking that," Caleb said. "It works." 20 minutes in, the light down to its last copper haze, Mara stopped. She stopped absolutely mid-stride, and Caleb almost walked into her. She was looking at a section of ground to their left where a cedar had fallen. Not recently, maybe 2 seasons ago, creating a low-angled shelter where the root ball had pulled up a section of earth and left a hollow in the ground underneath. Pointed at it. Hatch pushed past them both. "Tommy." His voice cracked open on the name. "Tommy, you in there?" A sound from under the fallen cedar, small and exhausted and undeniably real. Hatch went to his knees in the dirt and reached into the hollow and pulled his son out. The boy was cold, dirty, tear-streaked, and intact. And when his father's arms came around him, he made the sound that children make when the thing they've been too frightened to hope for finally happens. Hatch's whole body shook with it. Caleb stood back. Mara was standing 2 feet to his left, watching. She watched the way she watched everything. Not detached, but complete. Taking in the whole of it, the father and the son and the cold ground and the fading light. Her face held an expression he hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen as clearly. It was the expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. Not relief exactly, because relief implies uncertainty about the outcome. It was more like completion. Like this was what she had been for, and she had done it, and now the world could continue. He wanted to say something. He couldn't think of anything that was large enough or small enough. Was everything that came to mind was either too much or insufficient. So he said nothing. He just stood beside her in the last of the October light, while Jacob Hatch held his son against his chest and wept without embarrassment into the boy's dirty hair. The other men arrived 20 minutes later, having redirected when they heard Hatch's call. They came crashing through the cedar and pulled up short at the sight of Tommy alive and held. And there was a long, confused moment while the situation rearranged itself in everyone's understanding. Burkett was among them. Came in from the north, his horse blowing hard, and he took in the scene, the boy, the father, and Mara standing at the edge of the light, and his face went through several things, in quick succession, none of which he managed to conceal. He looked at Mara. She looked back at him, the same way she'd looked at him in the yard, on the night he'd come with lanterns and threats direct. Complete, unafraid. But there was something different in it now. The difference between a person who looks at you because they have to and a person who looks at you because they've already decided they don't need you to understand them. Ket looked away first. Again, he said nothing. Nobody said anything. The boy was alive, and the searchers were tired, and the cold was coming in from the north, and there was no clean category for what had happened here. No word in the available vocabulary of Denton Crossing, Texas, 1,881, that covered a woman who could find a missing child in failing light by reading the ground with her palms. So they said nothing, and they rode back. And Caleb rode beside Mara and watched the stars appear one at a time in the darkening sky, and he thought about completion, and about what a person is for, and about a look on a face that meant a person had stopped needing the world to explain itself to her. He thought Mara Bell had always known what she was for. He was only now beginning to understand what that meant for him. Nobody talked about the search directly. That was the thing Caleb noticed in the days following. Nobody in Denton Crossing came to him and said, "We were wrong," or "She found the boy," or "Maybe we misjudged her." People of that town were not built for that kind of directness, at least not when it required them to walk something back. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more telling. Quality of the silence changed. Driscoll stopped making the face when Caleb came into the feed store. Burkett, who Caleb passed on the road 3 days after the search, gave a short nod from his horse, not warm, not apologetic, but the kind of nod that acknowledges another man's existence without the preceding coldness. Agnes Greer, predictably, told anyone who would listen about Tommy Hatch and the limestone shelf and the cedar hollow, and while some people listened with the closed face, of those who had already decided what they believed. Others listened differently. The harness maker's wife, Ruth, was among the latter. Came to the ranch on a Wednesday with a basket of dried apples and a preserves jar full of something amber that turned out to be a honey apple spread she made herself. And she presented these to Mara directly and stood in the yard talking to Caleb while Mara examined the gifts with the careful attention she gave everything new. Crail won't come himself, Ruth said. He's not that kind of man. But he sent this. I'll tell her. How do you? Ruth stopped. She had been trying to figure out how to ask this since she arrived. Caleb could tell. How do you talk to her? Really talk? Not just gestures. He showed her the chalk. He showed her a few of the hand signs they'd developed between them, most of which were their own invention rather than any established system. Ruth watched with an expression that moved from curiosity to something more thoughtful. She taught herself to read? Ruth asked. Mostly. Filled in some gaps. Ruth looked at Mara, who had opened the preserves jar and was smelling it with the focused assessment she applied to everything she was considering using. How old did you say she was? 19. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and her father sold her. Yes. Ruth picked up her basket. Well, she said, and then didn't finish the sentence, because there was nowhere to take it that wasn't obvious. She said goodbye and rode back toward town, and Mara watched her go from the porch with the preserves jar still in her hands. That evening, Mara put the honey apple spread on the table at supper, and they both ate some on cornbread, and it was good. Ruth Crail clearly knew what she was doing with the stove, and Caleb thought about how strange it was that a jar of preserves from the wife of a man who'd come at night with a lantern and a mob could sit on the table between them and taste like something approaching normal. He said none of this out loud. There was no point. But Mara caught him looking at the jar at one point and made a gesture he'd learned to read as, "What are you thinking about?" He shook his head. She raised an eyebrow, the expression that meant she didn't believe him but wasn't going to push it. He almost smiled. She almost did too. That was the beginning of December. Winter arrived in the way that Texas winters sometimes do. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a sudden hard fact. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and by the following morning, the water in the pump required coaxing, and the horse's breath came in long white plumes in the barn. Caleb had winterized the ranch as well as he was able. The rebuilt east wall of the barns was solid better than the original, which had been the work of a previous owner who hadn't taken the wind seriously enough. The horses had hay enough for the season if they were careful about it, and the root cellar was stocked with more than usual, largely because Mara had spent 3 weeks in the fall laying in provisions with a methodical efficiency that suggested she'd done significant thinking about what winter here was going to require. He'd taught her to ride in October, starting with the most reliable horse he had, a gray named Pocket, who had the temperament of a patient uncle and the gait of something that genuinely wanted to be helpful. Mara had approached riding the same way she approached everything, not fearlessly, because she was not reckless, but with a calm assessment of what was required and a willingness to do the work. She fell off twice in the first week. Both times she stood up from the ground, checked herself for damage with a brisk efficiency, looked at the horse, and got back on. Caleb said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. By the end of October, she was riding adequately. By the end of November, she was riding well enough that Caleb trusted her to take Pocket across the south pasture alone, which freed up time he'd been spending accompanying her and allowed them to cover more ground in less time. This was purely practical. He told himself it was purely practical and didn't examine that statement too closely. She had been teaching him things too, though not formally and not always with chalk. He'd watched her enough times with the horses that he'd started doing what she did, standing at a horse's shoulder without touching, just being present before reaching for the animal. He'd started watching the quality of a horse's ear position, the way she watched it, reading the small rotations and angles that meant something was building before it expressed itself in behavior. He'd started noticing things about his cattle, the way a particular animal moved, the micro changes in posture and weight distribution that he would have missed 6 months ago. One evening, he caught himself standing outside the barn after dark, not doing anything, just standing, listening to the quality of the wind, whether it had the same weight it had had that afternoon, or whether something had changed. It took him a moment to realize what he was doing, and a further moment to recognize where he'd learned it. He went inside, feeling like he'd caught himself doing something that revealed more about him than he'd planned. The storm hit on the 14th of December. He had felt it coming, the way he always felt weather now, not the way Mara felt it, which was something deeper and more specific than he could reach, but with the trained awareness of a man who had watched her watch the sky for 3 months. The air had been wrong since morning, heavy and cold, in a way that was different from regular cold, the way a loaded wagon feels different from an empty one, even when you can't see the cargo. He told himself he'd have plenty of time. He was wrong. The storm came in from the northwest at a speed that had no manners about it. 1 hour, the sky was gray and still, and the next it was moving, really moving, with a wind that had teeth in it and a sound that climbed steadily until it stopped being background and became the thing you were inside. The temperature went off a cliff. Caleb was at the south fence when it hit, checking a section that had been looking stressed, and the cold that arrived with the wind was the kind that reaches past your coat and your skin and starts working on the parts of you that are supposed to stay warm, regardless. He started back toward the ranch. The visibility dropped faster than he expected. This was the part about Texas blizzards that even men who had survived several of them tended to underestimate. Not the cold, not the wind, but the speed at which the world became 40 feet of obscured space and nothing else. He could see the fence line, and then he couldn't. He could see the cedar break to his left as a dark mass, and then he couldn't. He found the path by feel and by the way the ground changed underfoot, and he moved as fast as he was able. And he was a way that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, that he was not in a good position. He was perhaps 200 yards from the barn when his foot went into a freeze-softened section of ground and turned under him, and he went down hard on his right knee. He felt something protest in the knee. Not a sharp pain, but the deep, unhappy compression of something that was going to make itself known at length, and he stayed down for a moment, taking stock. He could get up. He got up. He was moving slower than before, and the wind was doing something to his sense of direction that he needed to actively correct for, leaning into it from the northwest and keeping the feel of the ground slope under his boots. He did not see the barn until he was almost at the door. He got inside and stood in the relative stillness of it. The barn walls absorbed the worst of the wind, though the structure shook and the old timbers made sounds that were not reassuring, and he took a minute to let his body tell him what it thought about the last 15 minutes. His knee was wrong. His hands were wrong. His face was a problem he would deal with once he got to the house. He checked the horses. 5 of them, all present, all uneasy ears moving, feet shifting, the low communal tension of animals that know something is happening outside and don't know what it's deciding to do. Then he became aware that one of the sounds the barn was making was different from the others. Not a timber sound, not a wind against wall sound. Something higher and more irregular, a repetition, a pattern. He turned toward it. It was coming from the northwest corner, the section where the new timbers met the old, where the rebuilt east wall connected to the original barn frame. Crossed to it and put his hand against the wood and felt the vibration. Not just wind pressure, but something specific, a resonance that the structure was building in response to the sustained load. He'd heard it before. Not in this barn, in another barn years ago, before it came down. He backed up and looked at the northwest corner of the roof. The beam junction was moving. Not dramatically, a fraction of an inch maybe, but it was moving with each wind cycle, rocking on its joint, and the sound he'd been hearing was the wood talking to itself about how much more of this it could take. He thought about the east wall. It had been rebuilt better. He'd been sure of that. But the junction point where new met old was the weak place in any repair. And he had not. He saw it now with the clean vision of a man who is looking at a mistake he cannot unmake. He had not addressed the upper corner joint because he'd run out of the right hardware and told himself he would get to it in spring. Thought about the horses. 5 horses in a barn that was maybe 10 minutes from dropping its northwest corner onto them. He looked at the doors. He looked at the horses. He looked at the distance between where he was standing and the house. He could not move 5 horses alone in a blizzard with a compromised knee. He could move 2, maybe 3, if the visibility allowed it and the horses cooperated, which they would not. Panicked horses in a blizzard did not cooperate. The barn door opened. Mara came in with the wind behind her, pulling the door shut immediately, and she was already moving before she'd finished closing it. Already moving toward the northwest corner, towards the sound he'd been hearing, couldn't hear, but which she had apparently already known about, through some method he'd given up, trying to categorize. She had a rope coiled over one shoulder and she was looking at the upper corner joint with the expression she wore when she'd already done the calculation and was now implementing the result. She looked at him, looked at his knee, looked at his face. She held up 3 fingers, pointed at 3 horses, pointed at the door. He said, "You can't lead 3 horses alone." She pointed at herself, then at the 3 near the back, then at him, then at the 2 nearest the door. Her face said, "Stop arguing. This is what we're doing." Visibility's down too. She picked up the rope from her shoulder and showed it to him. She'd brought 2 of them. He held up the second one. She mimed tying them horse to horse, herself in front, which would let her lead them in a chain. Then she pointed at him and the doorside horses and pointed toward where the house should be, which was straight across the yard. Mara. She looked at him. "How long has the corner been like that?" She held up 1 finger. 1 hour. She'd been watching it for an hour. She'd known before he did, from inside the house, through whatever frequency she operated on, and she'd been watching the corner and calculating the time. Barn shuddered, a serious shudder, the whole structure, and the sound from the northwest corner went up a register. They moved. Getting 5 horses out of a panicking barn in a blizzard is not an operation that goes smoothly. It goes the way it goes, which is badly enough to be frightening, but not so badly that you don't survive it. And the difference between those 2 outcomes is usually speed and stubbornness. Caleb got his 2 horses to the door and threw it, and the wind hit them with full force, and both animals screamed and pulled, and he held onto the leads with both hands and walked backward and talked to them in the low, continuous voice that he'd learned from watching Mara. Not quite words, just sound and presence, and they came. Mara brought her 3 in a chain. She'd moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for one person with 3 panicking animals. But she'd gotten the halters on and the leads connected before he'd finished with his 2, and she came through the door right behind him, and they got all 5 horses to the lee of the house and tied to the heavy posts Caleb had installed there for exactly this purpose after the October storm. They made it back inside the house. Caleb sat down on the floor because his knee had decided it was done cooperating, and he sat there for a moment with his back against the wall, while the storm threw itself against the outside of the house, and the horses outside shifted and complained at their posts. Mara was already at the stove, getting it going, her hands working fast and certain. The northwest corner of the barn came down 11 minutes later. They heard it from inside the house, a sound that was less like a collapse and more like a conclusion. The timber finally reaching the end of the argument it had been having with itself all afternoon. Crash was swallowed almost immediately by the wind, which absorbed everything. Caleb sat on the floor and listened to it, and thought about his knee, and about the hardware he hadn't gotten in spring, and about a woman who had come into a blizzard with a rope over her shoulder because she'd been watching a corner joint for an hour from inside a house, and had calculated the time to the nearest 20 minutes. Mara crouched in front of him. She looked at his knee. She reached for it without asking, her hands pressing in that specific, knowing way around the joint. And he didn't protest because he'd learned that protesting her assessment was always more work than accepting it. Her face told him what he already suspected. Not broken, but wrong. Something in the tissue. Rest it. She wrote on the chalkboard, "How long has that corner been bad?" He looked at the ceiling. "Since I rebuilt the wall. I knew I needed to address it." She waited. "Spring," he said. "I was going to fix it in spring." She erased the board and wrote, "Always spring." He said, "I know." She erased it again and wrote, "All 5 horses safe." Yes. She sat back on her heels. She looked at him with an expression that was not. "I told you." She had never, in all the weeks since October, deployed that look, which was either remarkable self-control or evidence that she simply didn't operate that way. And instead, her face showed something quieter. Something that Caleb, who was not a man inclined toward elaborate internal description, could only call, "This is what I'm here for. This specific thing. This," he said. "Thank you." She looked at the word in his mouth and reading his lips the way she read everything, and she tilted her head slightly. Then she got up and went to the stove and started making something hot. He sat on the floor and listened to the storm and thought about spring and about corners and about the specific mathematics of waiting too long for the wrong reasons. January was the month people started coming. Not in groups this time, nothing like the lantern and horse formation of October, but one at a time, quietly, at various distances from admitting why. A farmer named Cott arrived with a cow that had stopped producing, and he addressed Caleb entirely when he spoke, but angled the cow toward Mara when he led it through the yard. A woman named Delphine, who lived alone on the creek, brought a horse with a wound that wasn't healing, and she said she'd heard. She looked at the ground when she said it, that there was someone here who was good with wounds. There was also a young couple, the Harmons, who had been in Denton, crossing less than a year. Too new to have been at the October meeting, too new to have inherited the established fear, who came simply because their dog had been bitten by something and they were worried about it, and someone had told them there was a woman at the Rourke place who knew about animal injuries, and they had come with the uncomplicated directness of people who needed help and went looking for it. Mara worked with all of them. She did not discriminate based on who had stood in the yard with lanterns and who hadn't. Caleb watched for it. He was not as forgiving by disposition as she was, and he watched to see if she would treat Cott's cow differently from the Harmon's dog, would give less attention or less care to the people who had come back only because they needed something. Didn't. She gave everyone the same quality of attention, which was the same quality she gave everything. Complete. He had complicated feelings about this. He knew that was his problem and not hers. Tad had been watching the parade of visitors with 14-year-old intensity and had apparently decided at some point in January that he had things he wanted to know. He cornered Caleb one afternoon while Mara was in the south pasture checking on the cattle. "Can I ask her something?" Tad said. "You can ask. I'll write it. Does she—" Tad chewed the inside of his cheek. "Does she know why she is the way she is? Like, does she have an explanation for it?" Caleb thought about this. "I don't know." "Have you asked?" "No." Tad looked at him with the expression of someone who cannot understand why an obvious question has not been asked. Caleb understood why. It was the same reason he didn't push at the roots of things that were working. You ask the question. You might get an answer that changes something, and some things were better left at the level of "they work." "Ask her," Tad said. Caleb asked her that evening. He wrote, "Tad wants to know if you understand why you sense things other people don't." Mara read it. She sat with it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Then she took the chalk and wrote slowly, and with more care than usual, "I hear what everything is saying. People stopped listening so long ago, they forgot there was anything to hear." Caleb read it twice. Then he wrote, "And you never stopped." She shook her head. He wrote, "Why not?" She looked at the question. Then she wrote, "No one taught me to." He sat with that for a while. There was a whole story in that sentence, the specific shape of a childhood, where no one had taught her the convenient human habit of tuning things out, because no one had been paying enough attention to her to teach her anything at all. She had been left alone, consistently and thoroughly, and in that aloneness, she had simply kept listening to whatever spoke to her, which turned out to be everything. The father who'd sold her had done the most terrible and ironic kind of damage. By ignoring her completely, he had accidentally left her original. Caleb wrote none of this because he didn't know how to put it in words she could read, without it sounding like he was feeling sorry for her, which she would not want, and which was not quite what he felt anyway. What he felt was closer to. He thought about the word for a while: recognition. The recognition of someone who had also spent a long time alone, and who had also developed, in that aloneness, ways of understanding things that other people found inconvenient. He blew out the lamp and they went to their respective rooms, and the ranch was quiet under the cold January sky. The fight that almost broke them happened in February. It started with Tad's stepfather, a man named Weeks, who had the particular cruelty of men who are large and unquestioned in their own households, and who mistake the absence of resistance for a general right. Weeks had been using Tad as what he was: free labor, a body to direct and occasionally hit when the mood required it. And this had been going on since Tad was 11, which Caleb knew and had done nothing meaningful about, which was a thing he was not proud of. What happened in February was that Weeks showed up at the ranch, looking for Tad, who had been there since morning, and Mara was teaching Tad something at the time, a hand sign system she'd begun passing on to him, which had started as practical communication and had become something Tad pursued, with the intensity of a boy who has discovered he's good at something, and Weeks found them in the barn. The boy's hands moving in shapes that Weeks didn't recognize and therefore didn't like. Weeks took Tad by the arm. Not gently. Caleb was at the house and didn't see the first part of it. He came into the barn because some change in the quality of the air, some frequency told him to. He was learning. He saw Weeks's hand on Tad's arm and the way Tad had gone instantly, completely still in the particular way of someone managing a familiar danger. And he saw Mara across the barn, watching with an expression that was past reading and into something else entirely. "Let him go," Caleb said. Weeks looked at him. He was a big man who had never had to develop subtlety because he'd never needed it. "Boy owes me a day's work. Then he'll work it. Let his arm go." Weeks let it go. Not because Caleb had told him to, but because the grip had accomplished what it was meant to accomplish, which was to remind Tad of the established order of things. "You," Weeks said to Tad, with the flat authority of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice. Home Tad went. He didn't look at Caleb or at Mara when he left. He looked at the floor, and that was worse than anything else. Weeks looked around the barn with the expression of a man making an assessment. His eyes stopped on Mara. "You're the bell girl," he said. Couldn't hear him. She was watching his face. "She can't hear you," Caleb said. "I know what she is." Weeks looked at her with an expression that Caleb recognized from the auction yard, the specific look of a man calculating what something is worth and finding the number low. "My wife went to see her last month. For the chickens." "I know. I don't hold with it." "That's your right." Weeks moved his jaw. "Boy's been spending too much time out here. Learning hand talk from a deaf mute like it's going to do him any good. Time he could be spending on useful things." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage him to come here." The conversation had been in front of Mara the entire time. Couldn't hear the words, but she was reading the body language, Weeks' posture, Caleb's posture, the direction of their eyes. And Caleb knew she understood the shape of what was being said even without the content. "Tad is welcome here when he wants to come," Caleb said. "If you have a problem with that, that's a conversation between you and me, and not one that happens in my barn." Weeks looked at him. Then he looked at Mara one more time, the same calculating look, longer this time, and there was something in it that Caleb didn't like in a way that went past the abstract, something specific and cold. Weeks left. The fight between Caleb and Mara happened an hour later. It was not their first disagreement. They'd had the horse argument in November. But it was the first one with real heat in it, and the heat was Caleb's. He wrote, harder than necessary on the chalkboard, "Weeks is not safe. You should not be alone with him." She read it and wrote back. I know, he wrote. I don't think you understand what men like that are capable of. She looked at that for a long moment. Then, she wrote with a deliberateness that was its own kind of emphasis. I understand better than you. He started to write again, and she put her hand on the chalkboard, stopped him. She looked at him with an expression that was patient, in the way that people are patient when they are explaining something to someone who should already know it, and she held his gaze until he understood what she was saying without any words at all. She had grown up with men like Weeks. She had grown up understanding men like Weeks in the way that you understand things you've had to survive. She didn't need Caleb to explain the danger to her. She had been managing that particular kind of danger since she was old enough to understand that she was on her own. Put the chalk down. He was angry, and the anger had nowhere to go because it wasn't at her. It was at all of it, at Weeks, and at the father on the barrel, and at every person who had ever treated her existence as a problem to be managed. And she was standing right there, and she couldn't even hear him if he yelled, which was perhaps for the best. He went outside. He split wood for 45 minutes in the February cold, and then he went back inside, and she was at the stove making something. And he sat at the table, and she put a cup in front of him without looking at him, and he sat with it until it cooled. Eventually he wrote on the chalkboard, I'm sorry. She read it. She wrote, For what? He wrote for thinking, I needed to explain something to you that you already knew. She erased the board. Wrote, Stop, eat, he ate. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions were for people who had simple disagreements, and what had happened was not simple. It was Caleb running up against the limits of his understanding, and Mara running up against the frustration of being perpetually explained to, and neither of them had found a way to apologize for the real thing, because the real thing didn't have a clean word. They ate supper, and she put the lamp out. At the usual time, and in the morning they got up and worked, which was its own kind of resolution. Not the tied-up kind, just the continuing kind, which is usually more honest anyway. Tad came back 3 days later, moving carefully around his left side, which told Caleb more than he wanted to know. He didn't say anything. Tad didn't say anything. Mara looked at the way Tad was moving and looked at Caleb and made a gesture that was a question. Do you want me to? He shook his head. Not today. There were limits to what could be fixed in one conversation. But he did, that week, ride into town and have a different kind of conversation with the county clerk about a boy named Tad Weeks and what options existed when a boy of 14 had no mother able to protect him and a stepfather who had established habits. Conversation was not conclusive. These conversations rarely were. He had it, and he made sure the clerk wrote it down, and that was the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. Spring came late and grudgingly, the way it does in years that have been especially cold, and when it came it brought the usual problems: 3 sections of fence down, a water line that had cracked in the freeze, and 2 horses that had come through winter with the kind of low-level illness that comes from months of cold and close quarters and not enough movement. It also brought something else. A family arrived in April to see Heder family, from somewhere east, the kind of family that moves west, because moving west is the answer to a question that doesn't have a better answer. They stopped at the ranch because their wagon had a wheel problem, and Caleb happened to be visible from the road. And while he looked at the wheel, Mara came out of the house, and the Cedar family looked at her, and she looked at them. The Cedars had 3 children, 7, 9, and 12. The youngest, a girl, had been riding with a cloth wrapped around her right hand, and Mara noticed it immediately, which was not surprising. What was slightly more surprising was that the girl, whose name was Latte, looked at Mara with none of the wariness that most strangers brought, and when Mara held out her hand open, palm up, the way she approached all animals, and most people lot put her wrapped hand in it without hesitation. The wound underneath was several days old and going wrong. Mara unwrapped it without expression and looked at it, and then looked at the girl's face, studying the face as much as the wound, and then she looked at the mother, who was watching with the tight, controlled fear that parents wear when something is wrong with their child and they don't know how wrong. Mara worked for 2 hours on that hand. She cleaned it in a way that clearly hurt, but she managed latte through it with a focus and a gentleness that Caleb found difficult to watch. Not because it was hard to look at, but because it was not. It was practiced. It was the work of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Even though Caleb knew that most of what she knew, she'd learned from plants and animals and observation rather than from anyone who'd actually taught her. She had built the knowledge the way she built everything alone, carefully, from scratch. Lot's mother wept once, briefly, and then collected herself. Her husband watched Mara with an expression that went from uncertainty to something harder to name. Who taught her? The mother asked Caleb quietly. Nobody, he said. Not really. The mother looked at Mara's hands at work, and then at her own daughter's face, and then at Caleb. She has a gift, she said. Caleb thought about that word gift. Mara had been told her whole life that what she had was a defect, a malfunction, an absence. He had watched it, described as unnatural, dangerous, suspicious. He had watched a mob call it a reason to exile her. He had watched it save a calf, and a barn full of horses, and a boy under a fallen cedar tree. Yes, he said, she does. The cedars stayed the night and left in the morning with Lot's hand properly dressed, and the mother carrying a small packet of dried things that Mara had put together, and Caleb had written instructions for in his rough handwriting. The father, leaving, turned back in the yard and looked at Mara, a long, direct look, and then he took his hat off the same way. Crail had taken his hat off, which Caleb was beginning to understand was the gesture this part of the world used when it didn't have better words. Mara received it the same way she received Crail's. That same small gesture over, done, it's nothing, but with a slight difference in the quality of it this time. Less something being dismissed, more something being accepted. She was building a vocabulary for being acknowledged. It was slow work, and it was costing her something each time, and she was doing it anyway. That evening Caleb sat on the porch steps in the April air, which had finally stopped being hostile and was considering being pleasant, and Mara came out and sat 2 steps below him, which put her roughly at his eye level when she turned around. She looked out at the pasture, where the horses were doing the specific leisurely, nothing that horses do, when the grass is coming back and the weather has decided to behave, he said, without planning to. You should charge something. She turned to look at him. For what you do, he said, when people come. You should charge them. You've earned it. She held his gaze for a moment and then turned back to the pasture. He said, I know that's not why you do it. She was quiet. But you could, he said. You could have something of your own. Turned to look at him again, and this time she held his gaze for long enough that he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has said something that exposed more than he intended. Because what he'd been circling around for months without the language, for it was, she should have a life that was hers. Not the life that had been sold away from her. Not the life of working someone else's land for the stability it provided. But something that was hers in the way that the ranch was his something chosen and built and could call her own. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the chalk, looked at her palms for a moment, the working woman's hands she had, cracked and calloused and capable, and then wrote on the step between them, This is enough. He looked at the words. He wanted to argue with them, and he didn't, because he thought she knew better than he did what was enough for her, and also because he suspected she wasn't talking only about the work. He looked out at the pasture. The horses moved through the new grass in the dying light, and the ranch that had been one man's isolated existence for 6 hard-send years sat around them in the spring evening. And it was not a perfect place. The east wall of the barn still showed where the timber was new. The north fence had a list to it that he hadn't corrected yet, and the house was 2 rooms, and stubbornly insufficient in ways he'd stopped noticing. But it was solid, and it was real, and there were 5 horses in the pasture that were alive because of a woman sitting 2 steps below him, who had come into a blizzard with a rope over her shoulder. He thought about the word enough, and what it meant when you'd spent your life being told you were less than that. He thought it might be the most powerful word she'd ever written. Summer came to the Texas Panhandle the way it always did, without apology, without transition, moving straight from the tentative warmth of late spring into something that meant business. The grass went gold early. The creek dropped 2 feet by July. The sky turned that particular shade of white-blue that meant the heat had stopped being weather and become simply the condition of existence. The ranch had changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have struck a passerby as remarkable. It was still 2 rooms and a barn and a pasture, and the particular arrangement of fence posts and outbuildings that Caleb had been adding to and ignoring by turns for 6 years. But the quality of the place had shifted in ways that were harder to point at than buildings. The horses were calmer, the yard was better organized, not because Caleb had gotten tidier, but because Mara had a system for where things lived, and she had simply implemented it without discussion, and over time he had started following the system, without noticing he was doing it. The root cellar was fuller than it had ever been. The south pasture fence was sound for the first time in 3 years, and people came. Not every day. Not in any way that felt like a disruption. Mara had no patience for disruption and had established, through some combination of scheduling and the specific quality of her presence when she was and was not available, something that functioned like hours. Mornings were for the ranch. Afternoons, when people arrived, she worked with them. Evenings were hers. Caleb had watched this system develop over the spring and had said nothing about it because it was working and because he'd learned to leave working things alone. What he had said something about aunts carefully, in chalk, was money. She had started accepting payment, not always, and not in the way he'd meant when he'd suggested it on the porch steps in April. She didn't charge a fee. She accepted what people offered, which was sometimes coin, and sometimes a jar of something, and sometimes a day's labor on the fence from a man who had more time than money, and sometimes nothing at all, because the person who had come couldn't afford anything, and she knew it before they did. Caleb kept track of none of this because she didn't ask him to, and because the keeping track was hers to do if she wanted it done. What he did know was that by midsummer, Mara Bell had more standing in Denton's sign than he had accumulated in 6 years of being a reliable tax-paying, fence-mending landowner. It was not the standing of someone celebrated. It was something quieter and more durable. The standing of someone people had learned to trust. Tad's situation resolved itself in June, which is to say it resolved itself badly and then better. Weeks had been drinking more than usual through the spring something. Tad reported in fragments, arriving at the ranch some mornings with the careful movements of someone managing bruises, and in the first week of June he had gone too far in a direction that Tad finally couldn't manage alone. Caleb had ridden to town the morning after Tad showed up with a split lip and a story that Weeks had apparently told in advance so that the first telling would be his. Caleb's conversation with the county clerk this time was different from the one he'd had in February. He was more specific. He had names, dates, descriptions. He had Agnes Greer, who had somehow heard about Tad's situation and was prepared to speak to what she knew. And he had unexpectedly Ruth Crail, whose husband had done his own quiet asking around and had delivered to the county clerk's office a written statement that Caleb had not known about and would not have thought to arrange. Weeks left Denton Crossing at the end of June. Caleb did not ask precisely what combination of official attention and community pressure had produced this outcome. He accepted it the way you accept a fence repaired by someone who knew what they were doing, grateful for the result, not needing every detail of the method. Tad came to live at the ranch. This was not a formal arrangement. There were no papers, no legal language, none of the machinery that might have made it official in a different time or place. Tad came with his things in a bag, and Caleb showed him the storage room off the barn that had been used for equipment and was now going to be used for a 14-year-old boy. And Tad looked at it and said, "It's bigger than what I had," which told Caleb everything. Mara had known it was happening before Caleb told her. He'd written it on the chalkboard. Tad is going to stay here a while, and she'd read it and written back, "I know." She'd already moved some things around in the root cellar to account for an additional person. She'd already calculated. He wrote, "You could have told me you knew." She wrote, "You would have gotten there." He put the chalk down. She was almost smiling. He was almost smiling. It was the closest thing to a shared joke they had, which was, she always knew first, and he was always getting there, and the getting there was fine, because he arrived eventually. Tad absorbed into the ranch the way he absorbed everything Mara taught him, with a focused eagerness that had nowhere else to go and was grateful for a direction. He learned the hand signs. He learned the system for the yard and the root cellar and the particular requirements of each horse. He was not naturally gentle with animals. He was a boy who moved fast and without much thought about how that registered on creatures sensitive to movement. But Mara worked with him on it with the same patience she had worked with the lame mare in the early weeks, and by late summer, Tad could approach a nervous horse and bring its ears forward in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Also turned 15 in July, and started to grow in the awkward, sudden way of boys that age, and started to have opinions about things with the particular conviction of someone who has recently discovered that having opinions is an option. Most of his opinions were about the ranch and how to improve it, and most of them were wrong in instructive ways. And Mara and Caleb between them managed the opinions with a patience that Caleb suspected he wouldn't have had without her example. The thing with Burkett happened in August. Caleb had not had a real conversation with the man since the October night in the yard. They'd had the road nod, the careful absence of acknowledgement that served as a kind of cold peace, but nothing that required words. When Burkett rode into the yard on a Thursday afternoon, Caleb was aware of the history in a way he tried to keep off his face. Burkett dismounted without being invited and stood with his reins in his hands, looking at the ground for a moment, which was the look of a man organizing something. "I have a situation," Burkett said. "All right. My granddaughter is visiting. She's been here 3 weeks. She stopped. She doesn't speak. Never has. She's 6. The doctors in San Antonio, I took her myself last year. They say she hears fine. They say there's nothing wrong with her that they can find. They say," he pressed his lips together, "they say she'll come out of it when she's ready. It's been 2 years, and she hasn't, and my daughter is worried. And I looked up. I heard about the Bell girl, what she knows, what she's been doing." Caleb said nothing. Burkett met his eyes. "I know how I'm standing here," he said. "I know what I said last October. I know what I was part of. Do you?" "I do." Burkett said it flatly without ornamentation. He was not a man who performed guilt any more than Mara performed anything. "I had reasons. They felt like the right reasons at the time. I'm not going to tell you they were." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and called for Mara. She came from the south pasture. She'd been checking on the cattle, which she did in the afternoons, with a regularity that had become part of the ranch's rhythm. And she saw Burkett standing in the yard and stopped for just a half second. Not fear, not anger, that same reading quality, taking in the situation and calibrating. She walked the rest of the way across the yard moke. Caleb wrote on the chalkboard, "His granddaughter doesn't speak. 6 years old, here's fine 2 years. Mara read it. She looked at Burkett. She held out her hand. Not a handshake, just an open hand, offered. Burkett looked at it for a moment and then took it briefly, and whatever passed between them in that contact was less a greeting than an acknowledgement. She wrote on the board, "Bring the girl." Burkett brought the girl the following morning. Her name was Clara, and she was 6, and she had her grandfather's coloring dark hair, serious eyes, and she came into the yard holding Burkett's hand and looked at Mara with a gaze that was, Caleb thought, uncannily familiar. Direct, assessing, unafraid. Mara crouched down to eye level. The two of them looked at each other for a long moment, the woman who couldn't hear and the girl who wouldn't speak, and then Mara raised one hand and made a sign. Simple, clear, a shape that didn't come from any system Caleb recognized. She'd made it up on the spot. Clara watched. Then slowly she raised her own hand and made the shape back. Mara made another one. Clara mirrored it. And Caleb was watching carefully. He would have missed it if he hadn't been. Clara made a new shape herself. Something that wasn't copying, something that was answering. What? Mara looked at that shape, and she smiled. A real one. Not the almost smile Caleb knew, but something full and sudden that changed her whole face into something he'd seen only a few times, and that always hit him somewhere undefended. Burkett stood beside Caleb and said nothing. "She's not broken," Caleb said quietly. That's what Mara's telling her. Burkett's throat moved. "I know that. Do you know how you know it?" Burkett watched his granddaughter make shapes with her hands in a vocabulary she was inventing on the spot with a woman she'd met 30 seconds ago. "I know it because she's my granddaughter," he said. "I know it because she looks at everything the way." He stopped. "She looks at everything the way your Mara looks at things. Your Mara." The phrase landed and Caleb didn't examine it. They stayed 3 hours. Clara and Mara sat in the barn for most of it, inventing a language between them that had no name and no rules except the ones they were making as they went, and Tad watched from a respectful distance, with an expression of concentrated fascination, and Burkett stood with Caleb in the yard, and they actually talked, for the first time, about land and water rights, and the coming fall and the section of road between their properties that needed grading, and it was not an apology, and it was not a friendship, but it was the beginning of something that might eventually become either one. When they left, Clara turned back in the yard and made the shape, the first one Mara had shown her, and Mara, standing on the porch, made it back. Clara almost smiled. It was the most expression Burkett said she'd shown in 2 years. He rode away without looking back, which was how Caleb knew it had cost him something real. The evening that changed everything between Caleb and Mara happened in September, which was the month the light in Texas starts to soften, the brutal white of summer pulling back, the angle of the sun shifting, shadows appearing at midday that hadn't been there in July. It was the light he liked best. It made the land look the way it felt to him when things were going right real and specific and worth the work. They had been on the porch after supper, which had become their habit. Not every evening, but most of them sitting in the specific arrangement that had developed naturally over months. Caleb on the top step and Mara one below, so their sightlines roughly matched, and looking at the pasture while the day finished itself. Tad was inside. He'd been reading. Mara had started him on it, patient and consistent, in the way she was patient and consistent with everything. And he was now 2 months in and reading with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. They could hear him occasionally turning pages. It was one of the longest silences they'd been in together, which was notable because they spent a lot of time in silence. But this one had a different quality. Heavy in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, but wasn't neutral either. Like a question that had been sitting in a room for a long time and had finally gotten tired of waiting. Mara took out the chalk. She wrote on the step beside her, not handing it to him, just writing where he could read it. "What happened to your family?" Caleb looked at the question. He'd never said anything about his family, not in any direct way. She had gathered things. He knew pieces from what he'd said and hadn't said, from the arrangement of the house, from what was in it, and what was conspicuously absent. She was too observant to have missed what his life had looked like before she arrived. Could have deflected. He'd deflected this question from everyone he'd ever known. It was one of the primary features of living 20 miles from town. You could curate what people knew about you with some reliability. He looked at the question, written in her large, careful print on the step. He thought about what it had cost her to ask it. She didn't ask things easily. She was not a prying person, not a person who pushed at what wasn't offered. She had sat beside him on this porch for 5 months and not asked. The fact that she was asking now was itself an answer to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. He took the chalk. He wrote, "Wife, daughter, 7 years ago. Fever took them both in 2 weeks." Mara read it. He wrote, "Daughter was 3, wife was 26. He hadn't written those facts in 7 years. He'd barely said them out loud in 7 years. On the step, in chalk, in the September light, They looked different from how they lived in his head, and smaller and larger at the same time. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I'm sorry." 2 words. He'd been offered condolences in every form available, from the elaborate to the helpless. And 2 words on a step in chalk hit him somewhere that the others hadn't reached. Possibly because they came without any of the additional language that people usually loaded onto such words. Just the thing itself. "I'm sorry, cleanly given," he wrote. "I stayed here after, couldn't leave, couldn't figure out why I should." She read that, wrote, "and now," he looked at, "and now for a while." Then he wrote, "Now I have a reason." He felt her read it. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the pasture, which was going gold in the last light. He heard her breath shift slightly, the almost imperceptible change in a person's breathing when something lands, somewhere real. She took the chalk. "Wrote me too." They sat in the September light until the stars came out, which happened gradually, and then completely, and the temperature dropped in the specific Texas September way that felt like permission. And somewhere out past the south fence, a coyote called once, and was answered by 2 others, and inside the house, Tad turned another page. Caleb didn't take her hand that night. That was not where they were, and he was not a man who moved toward things he wasn't sure of. But at some point in the long quiet of the evening, their shoulders were touching, his upper arm against hers. Simple contact, neither of them having moved toward it noticeably, but both of them having arrived at it, and neither of them moved away. That was something. It was in its way everything. The morning Mara spoke out loud, for the second time in Caleb's experience, happened on a Tuesday in October, 1 year and 2 weeks after he'd paid $5 for her at an auction in Denton Crossing. He'd known she had a voice. He'd heard it once at the auction, when she'd said her name, that rough-shaped sound from a throat that had never heard itself. He'd never pushed for more. It had seemed like something that belonged to her in a way that his wanting it would only complicate. They were in the barn. He was working on the tack, and she was beside the lame mare, who was not lame anymore. Hadn't been for months. Moving now with the particular ease of an animal that has learned to trust the people around it. And Mara had her forehead resting against the mare's neck in the way she sometimes did. Not grooming, not treating, just being present with the animal in a way that seemed to cost her nothing and give her something. Caleb was aware of her, the way he was always aware of her, that background attention that had become part of how he occupied any room she was also in. But he was working, focused, not watching. He heard it. 2 sounds, rough and real, and shaped with enormous care, shaped by someone who could not hear her own voice and was working from something else entirely, from the vibration of sound in her throat and chest, from some internal template she had built, from watching mouths move for 19 years. He went still. The mare's ear turned toward the sound. The mare knew Mara's sounds, the ones she made unconsciously, the small exhalations and tones that weren't speech but were communication of some kind. This was different. This was intentional. He didn't look. He was afraid to look. In the way you're afraid to look at something, you don't want to stop by noticing it. He said it again. Clearer this time. 2 syllables. She'd been practicing. He understood all at once that she had been practicing. In the mornings before he woke, at night when the house was quiet, the way she practiced everything, alone, and without asking for help, until she was ready. Turned. She was looking at him, her hand still on the mare's neck, her face doing something that was at once the most open he'd ever seen it, and the most still, the face of someone who has done something frightening and is waiting to see what the world does with it. She had said his name. Not the full version, not with the clarity that someone who'd spoken their whole life could manage, but unmistakably, completely, his name Caleb shaped in her throat and sent across the barn on a voice that had never had much practice and was doing it anyway. He crossed the barn. He didn't say anything. He stood in front of her and looked at her face, and she looked at his, and the mare breathed out slowly between them. After a moment, she reached into her coat pocket and took out the chalk. She looked at it, then she put it back. She looked at him. She said, very carefully, each sound placed with the precision of someone working without a net. I hear you. Her voice was rough and imperfect, and nothing like what it would have been if she'd grown up using it. And it was the most exact thing Caleb Rourke had ever heard in his life. Not "I can hear you," because she couldn't. Not in the way the sentence usually meant. Something more specific than that. Something that had to do with his shoulder against hers on a September evening, and the chalk words on a step, and $5 at a livestock auction, and a man who'd lived alone for 7 years on a ranch 20 miles from anyone, and had convinced himself that the living alone was a choice rather than a surrender. His eyes went wrong. He let them, he said. "I've heard you all along." She nodded. She'd read his lips. She always read his lips, and she nodded. And that was enough. And the mare put her head down into the hay, and the barn was very quiet. There are things this story cannot fully tell you. How many years they built together on that land, and how the ranch became something larger than it had been. Not in acres, but in what it held. How Tad grew into a man who was genuinely good with animals and took those skills somewhere useful. Who came back to visit on the anniversary of his first full year at the ranch for the rest of his life. How Clara Burkett began coming every month with her grandfather, and then eventually without him, to sit with Mara and continue the language they had built together, a language that had no dictionary, but that Clara used to say her first word aloud to Mara before she said it to anyone else. It cannot tell you every person who came to the ranch in those years, with an animal or a child or a problem they didn't know how to describe, and what they left with. It cannot tell you the specific conversation in which Burkett, who was not a man who apologized directly, fixed 600 feet of the road between their properties without being asked, and said simply, when Caleb found him doing it, that the road needed doing. What it can tell you is what Mara and Caleb built, and what it meant. They built a place where observation was a skill worth having, where paying attention to the quality of an animal's breathing and the angle of a horse's ear and the way a child's hands move when words are not available, was understood as intelligence rather than strangeness, where the things that didn't fit into easy categories were welcomed rather than driven off, because the things that don't fit easy categories are almost always the most interesting parts of the world. Caleb built it with his hands, the way he built everything. Mara built it with whatever she was built from, that original, undamaged capacity to listen that her father's neglect had accidentally preserved. Together they built it in the way things actually get built, which is imperfectly, with arguments about horses and corners that need fixing in spring, and the occasional wrong choice that has to be lived with until something better presents itself. There's something worth saying here directly, because this story earns it. People who came to run Mara off in October of 1881 were not monsters. That's the part that's easy to miss if you want this to be a simple story. They were people who were afraid of something they didn't understand, and fear in good people can produce monstrous action. This is not a new discovery, but it is a consistently underestimated one. Burkett was not a bad man. He was a frightened man who made a bad choice. And the difference between those two things is the entire distance between a story that ends in tragedy and a story that ends in something better. What Mara understood, and what Caleb learned from watching her, was this: the antidote to that kind of fear is not argument. It is not confrontation, though confrontation is sometimes necessary. It is time and consistency, and the patient accumulation of evidence that a person is exactly what they appear to be. Not a threat, not a mystery to be solved, or a danger to be managed, but a human being doing their work in the world. And she never stopped doing her work. Not when they came at night with lanterns. Not when the town whispered. Not when the people who needed her arrived with the complicated faces of people who had been wrong and weren't entirely sure how to be right yet. She just kept working, kept listening, kept showing up in the places where she was needed, and over time the world around her adjusted to the reality of who she was. This is the slow kind of courage, not the dramatic kind, not the gunfight at the end of the street or the single moment of decisive action. the slow kind, which is waking up and doing your work and being what you are, day after day, in the face of a world that is still deciding whether it can handle you. It is in Caleb Rourke's considered opinion, which he formed over many years and many September evenings on porch steps, and which he never stated out loud, but which Mara almost certainly knew without him saying. The harder kind. He watched her do it. He learned from watching. He became, in ways he would never have been able to predict, from the man he was at 34 years old, at a livestock auction in Denton Crossing, Texas, a version of himself that was somewhat more open to the world and somewhat less convinced that living alone was a dignified choice rather than a slow giving up. She did not fix him. She was not that kind of story, and he was not that kind of man. And some things in Caleb Rourke stayed bent until the end. But the ranch held both of them, bent parts and all, and the horses were healthy, and the root cellar was full. And on the evenings when the Texas sky did that particular thing it does in October, all those colors at once, orange and copper, and something almost green at the horizon, they sat on the steps together and watched it. One year, on the anniversary of the auction, Caleb had kept track without telling her, and Mara had kept track without telling him, and they both understood this without discussing it. He took out the chalk one last time and wrote on the step, worth more than $5. She read it. She took the chalk from him. She looked at the step for a moment. Then she wrote underneath, worth more than any price. She gave the chalk back. She looked out at the pasture. He put the chalk in his pocket. It was a fine evening in Texas, and the horses were in the pasture, and the light was doing what October light does, when it's saying something true, and neither of them needed to say anything else. They didn't.